Afternoon, my friends. Shalom Aleichem. Aleichem Shalom. Very nice. My name is Lisa Roy. I am the manager of community building and cultural enrichment here at the Miles Nadal Jewish Community Center, which is located in downtown Toronto. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Al Green Theater and to the 2026 Annual Wolinsky Lecture in Jewish Life and Education. It is truly wonderful seeing so many familiar faces. A special welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time, and I know that some of you are here for the first time in a long time. Kindly take a moment and turn your cell phones to vibrate or to off. We are honored that York University's Kaczynski Center for Jewish Studies has selected RJCC as their new downtown venue, and we are so proud to be co-presenting today's event. I am also very grateful to Kalman Weiser and Julie Feinberg. I am also so grateful to my wonderful JCC colleagues without whom this event would not be possible. Technical Director Peter Fellhaber, Al Green Theater technicians Tiffany Yaw, Isabella Corelli, Shay Santati, and Sparrow Gonzalez, and our front of house staff Daniel, Celia, Sarah, and Pepsi. And now, it gives me very great pleasure to invite Dr. Kalman Weiser, Director of the Israel and Golda Kaczynski Center for Jewish Studies at York University, to officially open today's event.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you for that generous introduction. So I've already been introduced, so I don't have to explain who I am, which is one thing off my checklist. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you here today to the annual Wolinsky Lectures in Jewish Life and Education. Let me tell you something about the history of these lectures, if you're not familiar with them already. The Wolinsky Lectures were inaugurated in 1979, almost 50 years ago, with a generous grant from the Leonard Wolinsky Foundation to honor Mr. Wolinsky, an Ottawa-born businessman, long active in Winnipeg and Toronto, and his commitment to Jewish education and public affairs. We are pleased to have David Wolinsky with us today in the audience. Now, here's another interesting tidbit. The inaugural speaker in 1979 for the lecture series was none other, no less than Israeli statesman Abba Eban. For nearly half a century, the Wolinsky Lectures have brought a steady succession of speakers of international renown in the areas of Jewish life and culture to Toronto. We are very pleased to be partnering with the Miles Nadal JCC for today's event. This is our very first Wolinsky Lecture to be held in person since the COVID epidemic, when we switched to online presentations. If you wish to catch up on past events, you can find recordings on our YouTube channel or the Kaczynski Center website, where you'll find speakers addressing topics as varied as contemporary Jewish languages to Judaism in the cyber era. Now, you may ask why we are holding the event downtown and not at our Kiel campus in North York. And the reason is quite simple. The Wolinsky Lectures were always meant to bring together the world of Jewish studies and the larger Jewish community. For this reason, we are reviving a tradition of bringing the lectures to you, the community, even if we still encourage you to visit our campus for our various other events. And I can think of no better place to meet the Jewish community than the Miles Nadal JCC, which has long occupied a central place in the historic heart of Jewish Toronto at the corner of Bloor and Spadina. As an aside, I'll note that in this building I met my wife. My daughters went to preschool here, and I've given countless lectures here over the last 20 years. And I'm sure many of you present today have similarly positive feelings about the Miles Nadal JCC as a landmark in the history of Jewish Toronto. Now, this year's Wolinsky Lectures are provocatively titled, What Happened to the Lost Tribes? Traditional and Modern Approaches to Jewish Ancestry and Identity. Our two speakers will present two different approaches to the search for Jewish identity, a subject of perennial interest that has assumed new directions thanks to advances in both the natural sciences and the humanities. Now, before inviting today's speakers to address you, I'd like to explain how the afternoon will unfold. After the first speaker, there will not be a brief intermission. There'll be no intermission. We're going to have back-to-back speakers. After the talks, there will be a question and answer period moderated by my colleague, Professor David Kaufman, who is the J. Richard Schiff Chair in Canadian Jewish Studies and Associate Director of the Koshitsky Center. So please hold on to your questions for both speakers until the very end. Finally, after the Q&A period, we will adjourn for a kosher reception outside the auditorium. It's going to be in what's called the aerobics studio, although I don't think anyone's done aerobics there since 1988. But you'll be shown where it is outside this auditorium. You already know to keep your phones on silent mode. So without any further ado, I'll introduce today's speakers. Our first speaker, and remember there are two speakers, our first speaker is Professor Steven Weitzman, or Weitzman, yes. I was about to say Weitzman, now that we're on the Abba Iban theme, but Steven Weitzman. Professor Weitzman is the Abraham M. Ellis Professor of Hebrew and Semitic Languages and Literatures, and the Ella Daravoff Director of the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. His publications include The Origin of the Jews, The Quest for Roots in a Rootless Age, and more recently, Disasters of Biblical Proportions, The 10 Plagues Then, Now, and at the End of the World. He also co-edited the Princeton Companion to Jewish Studies, and he did not mention it, but his textbook on the history of the Jews, which he did with a number of colleagues, is probably the best-selling book used for modern Jewish history classes. Well, Jewish history surveys from antiquity to the modern era, and my own class will be using it this summer. His talk is entitled Genetics and the Search for Jewish Identity. Our second speaker is Professor Andrew Tobolowsky. He is the Walter G. Mason Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. His publications include The Myth of the 12 Tribes of Israel, The Sons of Jacob and the Sons of Heracles, and Israel and its Heirs in Late Antiquity. In addition to studying constructions of Israelite identity, he has published widely on the topic of comparisons between the traditions of ancient Israel and those of ancient Greece. His talk is entitled The Myth of the 12 Tribes of Israel. So now I'd like to welcome Professor Steven Weitzman to address you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming out on this rainy afternoon, and my deep gratitude to Kalman and to Julie Feinberg of York University's Jewish Studies Center, and to the very consummately professional staff of the Jewish Community Center here. It's really a pleasure to be with you all. Many of my lectures I begin with a joke, but in this case, I'm just actually the opening act of a two-part performance, so I'm going to forego the joke for now, but at the reception, if you introduce yourself to me and you want to hear a joke, I will tell you a joke. Okay, so as I said, I'm the opening act, and what we're going to be focused on with our two presentations is a very famous biblical mystery. And my job is to introduce that mystery, to talk a little bit about how scholars today are trying to solve it, but ultimately to get to how scientists, geneticists, are trying to use genetics to solve this mystery. And that will require introducing you a little bit to the use of genetics as a historical source. So that's my goal, and then Andrew will follow me with approaching this mystery from a different perspective. So the mystery that I'm referring to is the mystery of what happened to the 10 lost tribes of Israel. So I don't assume for the purposes of this presentation that you have a background in the Bible or biblical history. So I want to just give you a little bit of historical background so that you can understand the mystery and why this is so fascinating to so many different people. So probably many of you have heard that the ancient Israelites, the people from whom Jews today descend, were a tribal society, and they consisted of 12 tribes. Those tribes, according to the Hebrew Bible, once all lived in a single kingdom that was ruled by King David and King David's successor, King Solomon, and that was centered in Jerusalem as the capital city. But when King Solomon died, and his son came to power, there was a massive rebellion against King Solomon's successor, and many of the Israelites were very unhappy with King Solomon, and they were certainly unhappy with the king who followed him. So there was a massive rebellion, and 10 of the 12 tribes rebelled against the kingdom of David, and they formed their own kingdom. Okay? So for a long period of time, for several centuries, there were actually 2 Israelite kingdoms. And a lot of the history that's recorded in the Hebrew Bible is a history of both of these kingdoms. So there was the kingdom of David, also known as the kingdom of Judah. That was based in the southern part of what is now Israel. That was the kingdom that had the capital in Jerusalem. And that kingdom was ruled by David's successor, the successors, the descendants of David and Solomon. And there were 2 tribes based in that kingdom, and those were the kingdom of the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Levi. And as I think many of you know, Jews today descend from those 2 tribes. They take their name from the tribe of Judah. But then there was this other kingdom, this kingdom that broke away after King Solomon, that was based in the northern part of what is now Israel, and that was known as the kingdom of Israel. And in that kingdom, there were 10 tribes. There was a different dynasty in charge, or actually different dynasties at different points. They did not worship in Jerusalem. They had temples of their own. Actually, there were 2 sacred cities that were important in the northern kingdom of Israel, and it kind of is this alternate universe, this other Israelite society that was existing at the same time that the kingdom of Judah was. So these 2 kingdoms existed side by side for several centuries. And then what happens, beginning in the 9th century into the 8th century BCE, before the Common Era, is that this Mesopotamian superpower comes in and it attacks the northern kingdom of Israel. Eventually will also attack the southern kingdom of Judah, but the southern kingdom of Judah survived, but the northern kingdom of Israel is conquered by this Mesopotamian superpower called the Assyrians. And that is what's going to lead us to the mystery that I want to talk about, which is what happened to the inhabitants of this northern kingdom of Israel, of the 10 tribes of the kingdom of Israel. So what I have on the screen right now is the Bible's account of what happened to these tribes. And I'll just read it to you quickly. And this is from the book of Kings, 2 Kings, chapter 17, if you're interested in the source. So Israel, this refers to the 10 tribes of Israel living in the north, was carried off to the land of Assyria, where they remain to this day. And the king of Assyria transported colonies of people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and resettled them in the cities of Samaria, replacing the people of Israel. So the Assyrians took over Samaria and the other cities of Israel. So what this passage is saying is that the Assyrians conquered the kingdom of Israel, that northern kingdom of Israel, and it deported the 10 tribes that lived there, and it replaced them with other peoples that were taken from other parts of the Assyrian Empire. Okay? So according to the biblical account, the inhabitants of Israel, in the northern kingdom of Israel, these 10 tribes, were deported somewhere. We don't exactly know where. Okay? Other people were brought in to replace them. And what's interesting, though, is also the Bible notes that these Israelites who were deported, they live there to this day. They still survive. Okay? And this is what triggered the mystery that we're referring to as the mystery of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Okay? It is the mystery of what happened to these people, but also where are they now? Because according to the biblical account, they still existed, they survived. They didn't just disappear or die off. So that's the mystery that Andrew and I are going to be addressing from different perspectives. And, we'll see if we solve it or not, but that's the mystery. Okay, so scholars today, biblical scholars, how do they, first of all, I should back up a second and say that part of what's interesting about this event, it's one of the few events in the Hebrew Bible that we have corroboration of the event actually happening from sources outside the Bible. So a lot of events that are in the Bible, we don't, if we're just applying a secular academic approach to the Bible, we can't actually know for certain that they actually took place. So Abraham probably existed, but we don't have any account other than the Bible to prove that he existed, or to tell us when he lived, or to confirm that he did the things that the book of Genesis claims that he did. So he's kind of a little bit beyond the reach of historians. And the same is true of the Exodus, Moses. We don't have evidence from outside the Bible to prove that these events really occurred in the way that the book of Exodus suggests. But in the case of the conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel and the deportation of the people who lived there, we do have extra biblical evidence to corroborate the biblical account, and that is the testimony of Assyrian sources themselves, of Mesopotamian sources themselves. So what's on the screen now is a translation of a line from the annals of an Assyrian king by the name of Sargon II, who is one of the Assyrian kings who conquered the land of Israel in this period. And he says very straightforwardly, I besieged and conquered Samaria, which is the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel, and led away as booty 27,290 inhabitants of it. Okay? So this is a very unusual and precious case where we actually have an account from the Mesopotamians themselves that is consistent with the Bible's account of what happened to the Israelites. And it suggests that we're dealing with a real historical event here. We're not talking about, complete fiction or mythology, but we're really in the realm of history, and this Assyrian source is reporting that indeed a population was taken from this northern kingdom to somewhere in the Assyrian Empire. Okay, so how do scholars go about tracking down what happened to the Israelites? So one approach is, we can't tell that much from the Bible itself. It doesn't give us that much information, but we do have Assyrian sources, as you can see here, and scholars have kind of been studying those Assyrian sources, looking for signs of the Israelites in the Assyrian Empire. And I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but I make note here of a forthcoming book by a scholar in Israel named Jan Safford, who is doing very painstaking work looking through these Assyrian sources, which are written in this very complex script called cuneiform, looking for Israelite names, just to look and see, can he find evidence of Hebrew names in Assyrian sources? Hebrew is different. It's related linguistically to Akkadian, but is a distinct language. And we can tell, when a name is an Israelite name versus a Mesopotamian name. And it's just been doing very painstaking work trying to see if we have any Israelite names in Assyrian sources. And indeed, he's finding Israelite names in these Assyrian sources. He gives one public talk, which you can find, I think, on YouTube, where he talks just about the city of Nineveh. The city of Nineveh is an Assyrian city that is mentioned in the book of Jonah. If you've ever read the biblical book of Jonah, the prophet Jonah goes there to prophesy against the Assyrians. And it was a very important Assyrian city, and we have records from it, Mesopotamian records for it, and Safford has kind of gone through records for that, and he's found enough Israelite names to conclude that had the historical Jonah actually gone to the historical Nineveh, he would have found a minion there. At least 10 Israelites he's able to detect in the Assyrian sources. So what he's showing in this painstaking research is that indeed some of these Israelites did actually end up in Assyria. They did actually survive. They seem to have been able to preserve their identity to some degree. At least they kept Israelite names. They, at the same time, were able to integrate into the Assyrian economy and find jobs there. So he's been able to find these little clues through this kind of painstaking research, and he has a forthcoming book. I don't know the title, but there's a book coming out soon where he's going to present this research, and it's going to show us that we can say a little bit about the Israelites that were deported from the land. But that's not a lot of evidence. It doesn't tell us very much. And really, we're kind of run to a dead end in terms of learning who these people were in any detail, or finding out how did they preserve their culture. And we certainly can't answer questions like what happened to them in the end, or where did they end up. We just can't answer these questions from the textual sources that we have. And that is what brings us to the genetic evidence. So genetic evidence, the use of genetics as an historical source is actually not a new thing. People have actually been trying to use genetics for actually the entire 20th century. genetics, the idea of genetics is rooted in 19th century science. The concept of the gene originated in the early 20th century. Scientists began to study the way biological inheritance works. At the very beginning of the 20th century, they began to make discoveries like blood cells, different blood types that people have, is genetically inherited. You could draw certain inferences from tracing the inheritance of blood cells and so on and so forth. The Nazis were big supporters of genetic research because it fit their racial ideology. Joseph Mengele, the infamous doctor at Auschwitz, who did these horrific scientific experiments on twins and others. Why was he there? He was a geneticist, and he was taking samples from the people he tortured and killed and sending them to a genetics laboratory elsewhere in Germany. So genetics is not a new science. It's been around. It's originated out of the 19th century, and it's been around in the 20th century, but for all of 20th century. But as I think you probably have read or know about, if you're a medical doctor, there's been a lot of advances in our understanding of genetics in especially the last 30 years, and people are beginning to have figured out ways to use it as an historical source. Now, I am not a geneticist myself. I want to make that clear. My knowledge of genetics doesn't run very deep, but I did have an opportunity to learn about it and engage it through an encounter I had when I was at my previous position. I'm now at the University of Pennsylvania, but before that I was at Stanford University for 5 years. And the humanities at Stanford weren't in such a great shape when I was there, and there weren't so many people to talk to. So I found myself making friends with these two population geneticists who are on the screen. The one on the left is named Noah Rosenberg, and the one on the right is named Marcus Feldman. And they are what we call population geneticists. So they are geneticists who focus on populations, on the distribution of genes in a whole population, as opposed to focusing on individuals' health. So they study populations and they use genetics to understand whole populations. And they also happen to be brilliant, but also very nice. So I developed a rapport with them. We began to talk about, is there some way to put the field of Jewish studies into conversation with in a deeper conversation with the field of population genetics. Now, at this point, this was 2011, 2012, there were already a couple books out on Jews and genetics, so it wasn't like we were talking about something new, but our goal was to kind of deepen the conversation between the humanities and history-centered field of Jewish studies and the science-driven field of population genetics. And we did a lecture series together. And I was shocked because I've organized a lot of lecture series in my time, and some are successful and some are not, but I've never had a lecture series where I had to turn people away. And this was the one time, this series we did on Jews and genetics, where we had to turn people away. And then we decided that was so successful that we were going to edit together a special issue of the journal Human Biology, which is a kind of it's a scientific, it's a journal of that puts science into conversation with anthropology. And we proposed and had accepted this idea to do a special issue on the study of Jewish genetics. And this was the first peer-reviewed journal devoted to this subject. So there had been books published, but they had not been subject to the process of scientific peer review. And the issue that we produced, which is here on the screen, Human Biology, was the first such peer-reviewed journal focused on that subject that was published. So a lot of what I know is not based on my own scientific literacy. It's based on my interaction with these two population geneticists. So what I learned from them is how much progress had been made in the study of genetics. So as I mentioned, in earlier decades, geneticists had tried to study human biology, to understand human ancestry. What can we learn from the inherited traits that we have about who our ancestors are, and what those ancestors, where they were in the world and where they originate from. But there was, and you probably have read about this or know about this, there was a huge advance in the 1990s leading into the early 2000s known as the Human Genome Project, which was a project very ambitious, one of the most ambitious and important scientific endeavors in the whole history of science. It was an attempt to map the entire human genome. So the human genome, the genes that we have, are based kind of, I don't want to bore you with a biology lecture, but basically, what we have in our cells is kind of an instruction manual that we call DNA, which is, a kind of a sequence of chemicals that bond together in different ways in kind of a long chain. And that long chain of chemicals is kind of a program, a kind of computer program that instructs an organism in how to develop and how to operate. And it's kind of the instruction manual that creates organisms. Okay? And we have, I think, 23,000 genes, and these little chemicals, they're called base pairs. I think there's about 3 billion of them in the human cell. So it's a tremendous amount of information encoded into our cells, a kind of computer program that guides how we develop as organisms and how we operate and why we have the color hair that we do and why we sometimes are susceptible to certain genetic diseases and so on and so forth. So that whole genome was mapped. It took a number of years and the work of who knows how many scientists, but that mapping project was completed in 2003. They've since been doing refinements, and I think it's finally been refined. It was only finally finished in 2022, but the kind of basis of it was completed in 2003. And it kind of laid out the entire instruction manual of human DNA for scientists to study. And what scientists realized, and they knew this before, but this advanced the idea, is that not only was this an unbelievable resource of medical knowledge that we've still only begun to really mine, but it's also an archive of historical information. It has information in it about our ancestors. Okay, why? Well, human beings as a species share about 99.9% of their DNA with one another. Okay, so everybody's almost virtually identical to one another genetically. Okay, but there's a 0.1% where there's genetic variation. Okay, why is there genetic variation? Well, one of the reasons for that genetic variation, the reason for that variation is that our DNA reproduces itself, it replicates. And every time it replicates, every time it copies itself, there are little tiny copy errors that get introduced. Like the DNA isn't perfectly replicated. There's tiny, tiny little mistakes. And then those mistakes are passed on to our descendants. Okay? And then if you have a population, a group of people, let's say a group of Jews, okay? They don't marry out, let's say they don't mate outside that group, okay? They have a custom of only mating within that group, which have been the case for Jews for much of their history. They'll only marry other Jews. So that means if you're only mating within that group, that means that there's a mutation. Somebody has a mutation in that group, and then that person has descendants. They'll pass that mutation on to their descendants, and that mutation will eventually kind of spread to the larger population. Okay? It won't spread to everybody because, you're only mating within that group, but it will spread within that group. And so then, therefore, you can use that mutation as a kind of signature of different groups. Koreans, they're a distinct population, and there are certain genetic signatures that are distinctive to Koreans. And people in Africa, in different parts of Africa, have different genetic signatures that they've inherited from their ancestors. And Jews, because for most of their history, they only mated within the group, a practice called endogamy, there are certain genetic signatures in Jewish DNA that are not completely exclusive to Jews, but they're kind of like a signature, they're unique to Jews. And therefore, if you take a genetic sample from somebody today, and they have that little genetic signature in them, there's a good chance that their ancestors were Jewish. That makes sense to everybody? Okay. So the most famous example of this is a DNA study that was published shortly before the whole Human Genome Project was completed, and it had to do with Kohanim, with priests. So many of you know that the Hebrew word for priest is Kohen, and that people who descended from the priestly caste in ancient Israel the males will often carry the name Cohen or some derivation of Cohen. And to this day, a lot of people with the last name Cohen can trace their ancestry back to a priestly caste in ancient Israel. Okay? So these scientists had the idea, well, let's take genetic samples from people who identify themselves as Kohanim, as Cohens, and let's see if they actually do have a common ancestry. So this study was published in 1998, and maybe you recall seeing it in the media. It got a lot of attention at that time. They did a large study of Jews of Jewish men from Britain, from Israel, and the United States, Jews who had a tradition or understood themselves to be Kohanim. So they took genetic samples from those groups, along with other groups, and they discovered that a lot of these self-identified Kohanim, I think 50% of them, actually had a genetic signature in their DNA that indicated they did have a common ancestor that went back 2,000 to 3,000 years, okay? Which is consistent with the Jewish tradition that Kohens all descend from a common ancestor, Aaron, the brother of Moses, okay? So this study was published in 1998. It got a lot of attention from the media because it was like this novel use of genetics to draw a historical conclusion, namely that Cohens today often do descend from a common ancestor. And B, it also was appealing to a lot of people because it was consistent with how the Bible and how Jewish tradition understood Jewish identity. So it got a lot of attention. Now, that was a long time ago. That was 1998. We're, almost 30 years later. There's been a lot of advances in the science. That conclusion doesn't hold up anymore, unfortunately. Now we know it's a lot more complicated, the picture, but it was really exciting at the time, and it drew a lot of attention to genetics as a potential historical source. And that's what followed the Human Genome Project in 2002. There have been a lot of studies of scientists trying to use DNA to explore Jewish ancestry, to explore, do the Jews actually come from the Middle East, as Jews have always believed? Where in the world, where do Ashkenazi Jews come from? Where do Sephardic Jews come from? We don't have the textual sources, the historical sources, to definitively answer these questions, but genetics offered a new kind of documentation, a new kind of historical source that opened a door, another way to kind of investigate these questions. So, of course, as you probably know, this proved so exciting that there was spawned a genetic ancestry industry. These testing companies, these genetic testing companies, that, if you pay $100 or $200 or $300, you can send them a genetic sample, and they'll do a test on it, and they'll send you a month later, they'll send you the results, and it'll tell you, oh yeah, you have a 99% chance of having Ashkenazic ancestors or something like that. It's a huge industry. I think Ancestry.com, which sold in 2020 for about almost $5 billion. So this is an industry that's developed in the last 20 to 30 years, and it's immense. And it just speaks to how much interest there has been among people in using genetics to explore their ancestry. And I would say the number one and number two, the two groups of people who see in America, the United States, who seem most interested in this research are, number one, Mormons. I don't know why. Ancestry.com was founded by Mormons. And number two is Jews. Jews are really interested in this research. And why is that? Well, people have studied that too, and there are many reasons for it. But one is that, of course, a lot of Jews in the United States are the descendants of immigrants. They can't trace their family ancestry back more than a few generations. Oftentimes they have the Holocaust in their family background, and there's been a rupture in the family memory. So genetics seems to offer this opportunity to kind of retrieve a lost family history that hasn't been preserved in the historical sources. Just want to make sure I'm okay with the time. Okay, we're going to skip that part because I want to get to how people have been using genetics to investigate the question of what happened to the lost 10 tribes of Israel. So the lost 10 tribes, as I told you, were these deportees from the northern kingdom of Israel. There are a lot of different people who claim to know the answer of what happened to the lost tribes of Israel. I think Andrew's going to explore some of those different answers in his presentation. But I want to get back to the use of genetics to investigate this question. So I mentioned this Stanford geneticist, Mark Feldman, is very pioneering geneticist of population genetics. And he, in that special issue of Human Biology that I mentioned, he published an article where he addressed this question. Okay? And I want to share with you his answer to that question. So his study was focused on a population in Israel today known as the Samaritans. The Samaritans are a very tiny population that lives in just a few places in Israel. They're based in Nablus, which is in the West Bank. There are also some that live outside of Tel Aviv. And they're a very tiny population, but they're an ancient population. They go back several thousand years. We can trace their history several thousand years. And what's interesting about them is that they believe they are the descendants of the northern tribes of Israel, especially the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, which are two of those 10 tribes I mentioned. So they have a somewhat different understanding of biblical history. Okay, they think they are the descendants of the biblical Israelites, as over against how they are understood by Jews. So already in the first century CE, a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus talks about the Samaritans, and he says the Samaritans, they claim to come from the tribes of Israel, but they're fakes, they're phonies, they're frauds, they're just pretending. Okay, they're really the descendants of those other people that were settled in the land of Israel by the Assyrians. They're originally foreigners, in other words, and they're only claiming Israelite identity because it's to their advantage to do so. And when it's not to their advantage to do so, they switch their identity and they claim to be foreigners. Okay? So according to Josephus, the Samaritans are imposters. Okay? And that's kind of a view that kind of percolated into later Jewish understanding. The Samaritans are they're pseudo-Israelites, they're not real Israelites. Okay? But the Samaritans have a very ancient tradition that they are in fact the descendants of the Israelites, that they don't accept that all the Israelites were deported to Assyria. They think that some of them never left the land of Israel, and they believe themselves to be the descendants of that population. So my former colleague, Mark Feldman, said, hey, and a team, he was part of a team. They said, hey, let's use genetics and see if we can learn anything about the actual ancestry of the Samaritans from the DNA, from what we can learn about their ancestry from their DNA. Are they unrelated to the Jews, as Josephus claims? Or are they related to the Jews because they are Israelites, as the Samaritans believe? Okay? And he and his team took a sample. They went to a Samaritan village. They took a genetic sample from 12 Samaritan males. And guess what they discovered? They discovered that the Samaritans, the male samples that they took, had that same genetic signature that was in Jewish priests, Kohanim. Okay? They had the same genetic signature as distinguished this lineage of Jewish priests that had this ancestor that went back 2,000 years or 3,000 years. So that seemed to be evidence, genetic evidence, that the Samaritans were right, that they did have some kind of ancestry that connected them to a shared ancestry with the Jews. Okay? And by the way, that had huge, for the Samaritans, it's a small population, but for them, it had very significant social and legal repercussions because it affected their legal status in Israel. Because in Israel, things like marriages are, it's a secular government, but it is obviously religion plays a very important role in Israel in social life, and things like marriage are under the control of religious authorities. So in the case of Jewish marriages, it's under the control of rabbis, and intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews is forbidden in Israel, according to the rabbinical courts. So the Samaritans are non-Jews, then they cannot marry an Israeli Jew. But if they are the descendants of Israelites, then they can be permitted to marry an Israelite Jew because they are from the people of Israel. So this had or has very significant social consequences. But this leads me to really the last point I want to make before I turn things over to Andrew, which is that The genetic evidence is very exciting, and it's scientific, and it's very impressive. But at the end of the day, history is always about interpretation. We have sources, and those sources are subject to interpretation, and different scholars interpret the sources differently. So we know this for textual sources. We know that, scholars, read the Bible, they draw very different conclusions about what really happened in Israelite history. And it turns out to be true of genetic evidence as well. It's true of genetic evidence as well. It's scientifically derived, but you still have to interpret it, and there's room for debate in the interpretation. So when Mark told me about this discovery, so I'm a Jewish studies scholar, I'm a specialist in the ancient Jewish world, and I recognized immediately that there was another possible explanation for the genetic evidence. According to Feldman, this was evidence that the Samaritans shared an Israelite ancestry with the Jews. But I knew about another incident that happened a little bit later in history that we know from Josephus, a historian I mentioned. Okay? He tells us that much later, in the time of Alexander the Great, this great Greek conqueror, Alexander conquered the land of Israel. And he established a governor in the northern part where the Samaritans would eventually live. And that governor wanted to establish a temple of his own. So he built a temple at a mountain called Mount Gerizim, which is near the city of Nablus. And he wanted a priesthood, but he couldn't just hire anybody to be a priest. He wanted somebody with a real reputation, like a good CV as a priest. So he recruited the brother of the high priest in Jerusalem to be his first high priest. So he brought this brother of the high priest to this temple at Mount Gerizim. And this high priest and this brother brought with him some other priests who also wanted a good job. And they became the priesthood of this new temple, this Samaritan temple. And we know from Josephus, moreover, that when these priests came from Jerusalem to this new temple, they married Samaritan women. Okay? So we've got these Jerusalem priests coming to the land of the Samaritans, intermarrying with Samaritan women and having children. And I asked Mark Feldman, hey, can't that account for the genetic evidence too? Wouldn't that explain why Jewish priests share this genetic signature with Samaritans? And he begrudgingly said it would. And he gave me a footnote in his article, but he stuck to his own interpretation. Okay? And I never published my view because I moved to Penn and I couldn't talk to them anymore because they were mad at me. So all this is to say that the genetic evidence is ambiguous. It's exciting. It's got potential, but it's ambiguous. But it leaves the mystery of what happened in the lost 10 tribes of Israel open. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Andrew, and I'm going to remember to switch to the next slide. And I thank you very much.
Thank you so much to everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm a little bit newer, I think, at giving talks than some others who have shared this stage. My first ever talk, I was in grad school. I went to the UC Santa Barbara, and I gave this talk on Homer and Hesiod. And when I was done, somebody stands up angrily, and they say, "You didn't say anything about Etruscan sarcophagi." And I still don't know why I was supposed to, but if that specific thing doesn't happen tonight, I'll feel pretty good. Thanks so much to everybody who has been responsible for bringing me here, and also to all of you for sharing your Sunday night with us. So I am here today to talk to you about stories. Stories are often badly misunderstood creatures in the same way and for the same reason that myths are badly misunderstood creatures. They get opposed to history. They are supposed to be false and made up. But even true pasts only live in the present as stories. We never tell all of the past, which would take as long as there has been moments in the history of the universe. We pick and choose. We never just relate the facts, which would be a chronicle, a timeline, a data set. We put them in order. We explain their relationship to each other. We give them significance. In the deep mists of the past, shrouding a whole landscape, stories are a lighthouse on the shore, touching here and there, telling us what to remember and how. The light makes its way through the darkness in one place or another, and all at once a coastline appears. This matters so much because identity is a story. It's tempting to think it is something else, truth, history, blood, descent, and certainly we can make a distinction between stories about who we are that have some basis in historical events and stories that seemingly do not, no matter how much they may be believed by those who embrace them. But identity stories also, and perhaps especially, don't relate the whole past and don't recite the facts alone. They pick and choose, shape, and attribute significance. And two different authors might do two different things with the same past at two different times, even if both pasts are true, or we might say, even if both stories are built from things that are true, wherever it takes them next. By the way, I cannot see your faces at all because of the light, so if you take a nap, I'm not going to know. I'm just letting you know that. So we used to think that identity was blood, whoever your parents and grandparents are. But a better way to put it is that descent is one of the pathways through which the ingredients of stories come our way. Probably the most popular and prevalent, but not the only one. In the United States, for example, I live very close to Jamestown, the first permanent British settlement on our shores. I celebrate Thanksgiving. I did this slide because they also use the word myth, not necessarily to mean that it's made up. My ancestors, who were neither British nor Protestant, had nothing to do with either and wouldn't arrive for centuries. Yet my history is a United States history, is on some level the history of my land and my nation, whether it really is mine in the traditional sense or not. And stories come from other places, as we will see. But when you say identity is a story, it can make people angry. The actual point, it can feel like you're saying that their identity alone is made up. The actual point is, in my view, is that this is as real as it gets. We can make a distinction, like I say, between stories that are based on real events and stories that are not. That's what a historian does. But both are something different than a mere record and something other than the pure truth handed down. The work we need them to do now here does not merely call them from their slumber, but shapes the nature of the creature they become. I'm told that once upon a time we believed that bears gave birth to formless lumps, that it was the mother's duty to look into shape. I haven't looked into this. It might still be true. My point here is not that all lumps are bears, but that the past does not have life until we give it form. And once we give it form, it lives and breathes and moves. This matters a great deal when we turn to what I have come to talk to you about today, what Steven also talked about, but this phenomenon that I call a world full of Israels. There are, as it happens, many different people who identify as Israelites or have been identified as Israelites by others, not only over the world and over the entire world, but for quite a long time now. The question we usually ask of them is, which ones are real? What really happened to the lost tribes of Israel? But even what really happened is only ever the starting point. Some of these are real Israels, some of them are fake Israels in the historiographical sense. But all of them take hold of a story, ancient, powerful, and resonant, and shape it into something new, sometimes more than once. The book that scholars call the Hebrew Bible, which other people know as the Old Testament or the Tanakh, tells the story of the 12 tribes of Israel, and it tells the story of the lost tribes of Israel. Starting in Genesis, the 12 tribes are the protagonists of the story, the 12 sons of Jacob, singular, and their descendants. They go to Egypt. They come out. They conquer with Joshua. They're led by judges. They're ruled by David and Solomon. And then, as Stephen already detailed, when Solomon dies, the kingdom splits into Israel, the larger kingdom where most of the tribes reside, and Judah, which will go on being ruled by the line of David, starting with Rehoboam. In 722 BCE, the new Assyrian Empire, far and away the power of its day, conquers Israel but not Judah, and according to 17:6, in the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and removed, etc. We've already talked about this. 1718, we read, none was left but the tribe of Judah alone. There's a math problem there. There's supposed to have been a 10 and 2 split. If none was left by the tribe of Judah alone, now you've got 10 and 1. It's complicated stuff. No biblical text tells us what happens to Israel's tribes. By the way, I took my last math class in 11th grade, so I'm not the guy for that part of it. They would, however, go down in legend as the 10 lost tribes of Israel, and this text does not say 10 or any other number. We get 10 from 1 Kings 11 through 12, the biblical account of the division of the kingdom between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. But this text has its math problems too. In 1 Kings 11 through 30, the prophet Ahijah tears his garment into 12 pieces. He hands Jeroboam 10 and says, 1 tribe will remain to the house of David for the sake of my servant David. 10 plus 1 could be anything, probably around 11. 1 Kings 12 through 21 is pretty clear that Rehoboam will rule 2 tribes, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, but 1 Kings 12:20 is equally clear. There was no one who followed the house of Judah but the tribe of Judah alone. And if the 2 tribes of Judah are Judah and Benjamin, what then of Levi, which is supposed to have been headquartered at the Jerusalem temple? What then of Simeon, whose territory is almost inevitably described as within the territory of the tribe of Judah? What about 2 Chronicles 30, where, apparently in the aftermath of the same Assyrian invasion, rather than thinking that all the Israelites had been removed and replaced, the biblical author describes King Hezekiah inciting those who remained behind to Passover? So on the one hand, 2 Kings 17 is a major explanation for a fascinating, much underappreciated phenomenon. Whether you know it or not, you live in this world full of Israels. And I want to take a moment to emphasize really how strange that is. There are people all over the world who identify as Israelites. There are Israelites in India, the B'nai Menashe and B'nai Israel among them. There are Israelites among the Pashtun of Afghanistan. There are the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, the Igbo Jews of Nigeria, the Abu Yudaya of Uganda. In America, the Mormons, the Black Hebrew Israelites, and others all claim Israelite identities, and so do smaller and somewhat stranger groups, such as the Israelite House of David in Benton Harbor, Michigan. In the 19th century, they were famous for their baseball team, the Harlem Globetrotters of their day. It was notable for playing barnstorming games against even the great Negro League teams of that era. They would ride camels in the outfield. They would do all kinds of things. But the baseball team had an express purpose, which was to fundraise for the community, which aimed to ingather the lost tribes of Israel. There are all these Israels, and there's only one, let's say, ancient Greece. There's only one ancient Rome. There are other groups that from time to time have laid claim to the mantle of one or another, the new Rome, the new Greece, but usually not in the same way. 2 Kings 17 offers one of the main explanation for why that is the situation. Many of the tribes are lost, and they might therefore be found almost anywhere. Who knows where they went after Assyria, or once Assyria was no more? Other biblical texts sharpen the knife. Various prophecies tell us the tribes will return someday, at the end of time when all is to be restored. So they must be somewhere, and they must be found, and many, many people have gone looking. Even in the United States, where I am visiting you from today, the search for the tribes was embedded early and deeply. Cotton Mather thought the natives of America might be the tribes of Israel, and so did William Penn, namesake of Pennsylvania, who once made a joke about there being more Jews than in the Jewish quarter of London when he was wandering in the natives' land. When Lewis and Clark set off on their famous mission to the Pacific, no lesser intellectual than Dr. Benjamin Rush would tell them to keep a weather eye out for the lost tribes of Israel. The biblical story of the 12 tribes and the lost tribes is the fountain from which all these stories flow. On the other hand, the story and reality stand a little bit apart, and in a way that tells us a lot about the Hebrew Bible and eventually a lot about us and the world around. Here is the deep, dark secret of the lost tribes of Israel. For the most part, they were never really lost in the first place. Rather, the Assyrian conquest of Israel did happen in 722 BCE, and the Assyrians did remove a number of Israelites to different parts of the Assyrian Empire, just as Stephen has detailed. But even in their famously braggadocious chronicles, I don't know why I chose to use braggadocious as a word, the number of people they actually claim to have removed is about 27,000 people, more in the vein of my current residence of Williamsburg, Virginia, than an entire ancient kingdom, even a small one. This wasn't the first or only Assyrian invasion. Tiglath-Pileser III had depopulated the Transjordan about 10 years earlier. Others besides those the Assyrians removed might well have wandered off all the same. But not only were there still likely a large number of Israelites in Israel after the Assyrians were done, they were mostly Israelites. There isn't a lot of evidence that the Assyrians brought in a lot of foreigners to replace the foreign population. So why does 2 Kings 17 say that it does? The answer emerges when we begin to think about who is telling us the story. Historians have known for quite a long time the Hebrew Bible was neither mainly composed nor put together in Israel, but instead in Judah. The Hebrew Bible claims that Judah and Israel are both Israelite kingdoms. The story of the 12 tribes of Israel goes a long way to explaining how and why. But if the two were ever really one, which some scholars actually doubt, then even in the Hebrew Bible they split in a period which now seems remarkably early, and they had separate histories ever after. They were two independent kingdoms with different neighbors, experiences, and destinies. When Israel was conquered, Judah survived. It would last for more than a century before being conquered by the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 586 BCE. Only the Judahites went into what is sometimes called the Babylonian exile, and only the Judahites, obviously enough, returned from it. The book which tells the story of the conquest of Israel ends in the period of the Babylonian exile, and therefore, of course, or a little bit after, could only have been finished during it or after. As a result, what we actually have in 2 Kings 17 is not history, but in a way, Judahite propaganda. Not that the Judahites are falsely claiming a past, but they're falsely writing someone else out of it. The Bible defines Israel as the 12 tribes of Israel. The Bible claims that most of those tribes were lost, never to return. Thus, the sole remaining legitimate heirs of ancient Israel are not only the Judahites, but specifically those who went into exile and came back. Well, even at the time, there were still Israelites in Israel, Judahites who had never been exiled, and eventually Judahites who never returned. Here's my question for you, which maybe we can talk about in the question and answer. How much does this matter? The biblical story of the tribes isn't, it seems, entirely historiographically true. Does that mean there's something wrong with it? Does that mean the people who told the story aren't really Israelites? Does it mean that the Israelites of Israel and only the Israelites of Israel really are? To me, the answer is it depends. And what it depends on is how we understand what most identity stories are in the first place. If we think there is a hard and fast distinction between identity stories that are simply true and identity stories that are not, are what we sometimes call invented traditions, then we will think that maybe the biblical story is a little more on the invented side. It lost the lost tribes on purpose in order to claim the entire legacy of Israel for its authors. I've done this with a number of my son's more annoying toys. You don't know where it is. Anyway, in my opinion, something else is going on. Something much more profound. The nature of identity stories is that they are something different and more than historiographical truth or falsehood. A story about the past is not merely a recital of past experiences, but often a medium for competitions over the past. And to say that is not to see something false, lying, underhanded, inventive, relative to other true stories. It is to see the role the past generally has in stories that form the charters of identity, the role of explanation, the role of justification. That's why we tell stories about who we are. It is to see quite a conventional, normal thing to do with stories being done, even when the events that serve as the key chapters in the unfolding of a people's history really happened. In my book on the lost tribes of stories, which was also called The Myth of the 12 Tribes of Israel, I started with the Judahites, much as I've done here, but I continued with the Samaritans, or the Samaritan Israelites, before moving on to medieval lost tribe legends, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, the Mormons, and many others besides. And I did this for a reason. The Samaritans, who still exist today and probably are the descendants of the Israelites, who were never removed by the Assyrians, they have existed in their native land the whole time. Aha, you might say, they are the real Israelites. But it's not that simple. Samaritan stories aren't just history either. From stories about how the community split off from the rest of even the Israelites already in the days of the high priest Eli, 3 generations before David, when no Samaritans yet existed, to stories about a competition between them and Judahites over whose version of the Torah was correct. There is a different Samaritan Pentateuch, in the context of the Babylonian exile, which our ancestors did not, in fact, go into. In their version of the Assyrian conquest, too, the Judahites do invite them to Jerusalem, just as in 2 Chronicles 30, but they refuse, asserting instead the superiority of their religious practices to those practiced at Jerusalem. As a result, my point was not that one story is true and one is false. It was the opposite. Here, in fact, are two real heirs of the Hebrew Bible, of who the Hebrew Bible describes as Israel. And still, they told their stories not only differently, but in a way that was fundamentally shaped by the very need to compete with each other over the legacy of ancient Israel. There is no neutral, only the facts identity story out there to compare them to unfavorably, to mark them out as inventions, especially in these cases where they have what we would generally treat as the sine qua non of identity, genuine biological descent. There's only ever people doing something with pasts, which belong to them in a way we understand belonging, or as it may be not. After the Bible, the story of the lost tribes of Israel starts slowly, an absence that was never meant to be filled, but existed to some extent for strategic and rhetorical reasons. But a mystery invites solutions, and it quickly began to acquire them. By the 1st century CE, new and familiar features of the traditions had developed. In the beginning, the mighty Sembachan River, which roars 6 days out of 7, then rests, thus its other name, the Sabbath River, was not connected to the lost tribes. It appears in 1st century CE sources such as Pliny the Elder and Josephus as a curiosity worth mentioning. But already in Josephus' time, the tribes were beyond a river, the Euphrates, and had swelled their ranks to, quote, an immense multitude not to be estimated by numbers. Another likely 1st century book, 2 Esdras or 4 Esdra, includes an apocalyptic vision which would become very common in other stories about the tribes. Ezra, the biblical scribe, beholds a sea lashed by a tempest, and a man arising from it who defeats his enemies with breath of fire and gathers many to him. He is told that these are the 10 tribes of Israel who went away from the lands of Assyria to another land and dwelt there for many ages, to return at last at the end of time. Actually, it says they went away to Arzereth, which is very interesting. It took people a long time to realize this was a corruption of the Hebrew, Eretz Ahereth, another land. So it was just the land of Arzereth to a lot of people who read this because they didn't understand the original text. By the middle of the 1st millennium CE, it was commonly believed that the tribes were beyond the Sambachan, or else in part there and in part elsewhere. Christians and traditions in particular grew the story, especially because of the connection Christian intellectuals increasingly embraced between the return of the tribes and the end of the world. And soon its reach would be extended by a kind of anthropological habit that developed over time. For those who believe in the literal truth of the Bible, that meant believing, for example, that the world was really populated after the flood by the 3 sons of Noah, Shem, Japheth, and of course, the most delicious but forbidden Ham. It's a joke. We didn't eat much ham growing up. I wouldn't know. If so, then anyone out there, anyone encountered at all around the world, had to be a descendant of someone in the Hebrew Bible, a Hamite, a Shemite, a Gog or Magog. And to this internal question, the lost tribes of Israel would be a popular answer. We might also say that they were a lens of sorts through which Europeans saw the world, and they combined with other legends that came from other stories. One example is the story of Prester John, the mythical priest king of the East. Rumors of the Prester had begun to emerge already in the 1140s, just after the fall of the Crusader-won county of Edessa to the Turkish leader Zengi Atabeg of Aleppo. Supposedly, Prester John had been coming to the aid of the Crusaders, but was stopped by the waters of the Tigris. Rumors said that he might try again, and in the 1160s, in one of the great hoaxes of the medieval era, he sent a letter. In it, he described a kingdom enormous and full of magical beasts. And in most versions of the letter, his kingdom includes within it a great river of stones, and on the other side, the 10 tribes of the Jews. They were always depicted as numerous and mighty, but sometimes somewhat tame, and other times more warlike and dangerous, depending on the virulence of the anti-Semitism of the author, essentially. I'm sorry to say. When the Mongol invasions began in the 13th century, it at first seemed obvious that the Prester was on his way, since they began, of course, by defeating Muslim kings in the East. But as they approached Europe, it became clear to some that they could only be the tribes, come to wreak vengeance on behalf of their immiserated brethren, the much oppressed Jews of Europe, who, incidentally, occasionally expressed hope that it might be so. Or perhaps they were the barbarians that Alexander the Great had locked away behind the Caspian Mountains with great gates of iron that had finally failed. At any rate, this is a type of phenomenon that matters a lot for the development of lost tribe traditions. Someone would suppose that they could be somewhere, and a swirl of stories would catch them up and turn them out again. Soon they would cross the Atlantic. They would reach the shores of Japan and China and eventually circle the globe. And soon not only those they sought, but the seekers themselves would begin to see Israel in the mirror. When we scrutinize the fascinating phenomenon of a world full of Israels, one way we can think of it as a testament to the power of imagination, invention, and hope. There were no lost tribes in the conventional sense, or at least not many, but there were and always have been Jews who traveled longer and farther than we might typically imagine. Many lost tribe sightings over the years have been nothing more exotic or less exotic than Jews who settled outside of Europe and the Levant. This is the case of the Jews of Kaifeng in China, or living on the Silk Road, the Jews of India, and other places besides. What we really see, however, is people doing something with biblical odds and ends, with an open-ended story, with prophecy, with a biblical map of the world. The interesting question is how different what they were doing is from what the Judahites were doing in telling the story their way in the first place. They're using inherited traditions to construct visions of identity with implications for the meaning of the past and the meaning of the future. Well, you might say they are not their traditions. But in a sense they are, since of course, for all of the people, in other words, if somebody else is using biblical traditions, they don't belong to them. But of course, many people embrace the Bible as their traditions. Let me tell you another story, the story of the people who became Israel twice. This is the story of the Beta Israel of Ethiopia. I take no pleasure in saying it, but most likely they're not the descendants of a lost tribe of Israel, nor even of a particularly early Jewish community in Ethiopia. It is not impossible. There were Jews in the area. In fact, in the early days of the kingdom of Aksum, the precursor state to Ethiopia, there was a whole Jewish kingdom called Himyar across the Red Sea, which the Aksumites conquered around 530 CE. But evidence of an early Jewish community in Ethiopia itself is lacking, and in any case, the best evidence suggests that the Beta Israel community itself formed around the 14th century BCE in the vicinity of Lake Tana in northwestern Ethiopia. This matters because it would mean that the Beta Israel were not the first official Israelites in Ethiopia. Instead, that honor would go to the Christian royal dynasty that was ruling at the time. This was the Solomonic dynasty, founded about a century earlier by Yakuno Amlak. According to their charter traditions, their kings were descended from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba through Menelik, their son. He had grown to manhood in Ethiopia, then gone to visit his famous father. He returned with his father's blessing, an honor guard of Israelites, and on his way out, the Ark of the Covenant as well. As Stephen Kaplan observes, the term Israelite in Ethiopian chronicles from this period is actually more likely to refer to a member of the royal dynasty than to an Ethiopian Jew. Originally, the Beta Israel's own tradition seemed not to have been very different. When James Bruce, the Laird of Kinnaird in Scotland, became the first European we know about in modern times to make contact with the Beta Israel, while searching for the source of the Blue Nile, the story they told him was that they too were descended from Solomon and Sheba. But when some of their ancestors had converted to the dynasty's Christian faith way back when, they had simply strayed true to their Jewish roots. Yet here's another important fact about the Beta Israel. Today, they mostly live in Israel, not Ethiopia. And they are so far as I know, the only group claiming lost tribe descent from outside of Israel to have ever been officially recognized by the state. They are certainly not the only ones who have tried. There are, for example, a number of Hebrew Israelites from the United States who have been living in the Israeli city of Dimona, hoping for similar recognition. The Abu Yudaya of Uganda have even gone so far as to undergo an official conversion ceremony, despite their pre-existing claims to Jewish descent. But they still have not been recognized either. The Beta Israel were in the early 1970s, but it was not their own story that punched their ticket. Instead, there was another story circulating in Jewish circles long before the Beta Israel community seems to have formed. It's the story of Eldad Hadani, Eldad the Danite, near the end of the 9th century CE. A man using that name appeared in Kairouan, in what is now Tunisia. The story he told was that he was a traveler from the land of Cush and a member of the lost tribe of Dan. In this land, protected by the mighty descendants of the judge Samson, who was a Danite, the Danites and other tribes lived in peace and prosperity. But Eldad had been shipwrecked, captured by cannibals, and lost his way before coming by hook or crook to Kairouan. There he told his tale. Not surprisingly, the Jews of Kairouan did not immediately accept the story, but instead called in an authority, the Gaon, or head of the Academy of Sura, a major center of Jewish learning at the time. Eldad was extensively interrogated about his Jewish practices, resulting in a report that still exists today, the ritual of Eldad Hadani. And in the end, the Gaon signed off. Eldad was who he said he was, a member of the lost tribe of Dan. This matters to our story because it turns out that rabbinic law, like many another law code, is to some extent precedent-based. Rabbis study what rabbis prior have to say before making their own ruling. And as a result, the Gaon of Sura's ruling meant that it was officially established in Jewish law that the tribe of Dan resided in the region of Cush, which for quite some time already had been associated with Kenya. No, it's Ethiopia. That's just a little joke. We like to keep it light if we can. Eldad himself was not an Ethiopian. Most likely he was a Yemeni Jew, to judge from the language he used. But his story was still the start of something. 600 years later, it was applied to an actual Beta Israelite for the first time. Rabbi David ben Abi Zimra told a petitioner he had to free a Beta Israel slave that a Jewish man had bought in the Cairo slave market. And in 1973, when Ovadia Yosef, chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, ruled at last that the Beta Israel were a Jewish people, deserving of the rights of Israeli citizenship, this is what he said. There is no doubt that the aforementioned authorities, who ruled that they are the tribe of Dan, carefully investigated and reached this conclusion on the basis of the most reliable testimony and evidence. He was seconded by Shlomo Goren, Ashkenazi chief rabbi, in 1975, and the door was open to bring the Beta Israel to Israel. So above all, the story of the Beta Israel of Ethiopia shows how it is that we live in a world full of Israels. There are many Israels in the world because the charter traditions of an Israelite identity, meaning the Bible itself, is rooted deep in the soil of many different places. The Solomonic monarchy claimed descent from Solomon because of the tradition, among the traditions that were already authoritative in Ethiopia, the Bible, of course, was among them. And it conveyed a prestige that did just what stories of this sort are supposed to do, justifying the dynasty's reign. In order to justify it more, they developed an Ethiopian version of the story, one that took a biblical episode, the encounter between Solomon and Sheba, however, where no children are conceived, and latched onto it by writing the next chapter. Then, because one prestigious group in Ethiopia did it, it made sense for another to do it. Claiming to descend from Solomon and Sheba as well was not originally a way for the Beta Israel to embrace Jewish tradition, although they did. But within Ethiopia, to lay claim to a heritage of equivalent prestige, and even in a sense a greater one, since their Jewish faith spoke to the greater purity of their connection to Menelech's Israelites. In other words, theirs is a profoundly Ethiopian version of Israelite identity, and in more ways than one. Many Beta Israel tradition and texts seem to come from Ethiopian Christian originals. For quite a long time, the Beta Israel, for example, practiced monasticism. Today, there are certainly still those who embrace the Solomon and Sheba tradition, but there are also those who embrace the story that was developed for use in their new context, the story of the lost tribe of Dan. But think about what else it shows. Say that you learn that the Beta Israel really were descended from lost tribe Israelites, or from an early Jewish community in the region after all. Do you think that after 2,000 years, their story would or would not have Ethiopian undertones anyway? Do you think it would not have been reshaped by centuries of experience, by the need to compete, justify, and protect the community? So in that case, would that mean the story was now true because the people at least really were, from a biological perspective, who they say they are? Or would it mean that it wasn't because the story itself was not the original one, but an Ethiopian one after having been adapted for use in ways that would allow it to do what identity stories are supposed to do? What can stories do but do the work they are meant to do in the context in which they live? Who are we if we cannot speak in a language that those around us can understand? In the classes I teach back in Virginia, I often make this point, which is essentially a point about how the pasts that survive are the pasts that stay or become relevant in different ways. I might say, I have no idea how this works in a Canadian audience, who here knows something about the Civil War? And a number of students often do. And I might say, who here knows something about the War of 1812? And almost no one ever does. It's not because they didn't both happen. It's because one has more meaning in the present. I talk about Alexander Hamilton, never a nobody in our historical memory, but somebody whose prominence today has much less to do with his actual role in establishing the first bank of the United States, and so on, than a Broadway musical that became a runaway smash hit. Again, we never tell stories about the past just because they exist or because they are true. We do it because we matter. They matter to keep them alive, and we do what we need to make them matter. Always, no exceptions. So this is the principle I'm articulating today. The seeds for a world full of Israel was sown by an open-ended story, a great mystery, and a religious necessity. For one more example of how the plants that sprout are shaped by the soils that nourish them, let us turn to one last story, the story of Israel in America. As I've already suggested, the so-called Jewish Indian theory originally arrived on these shores, if not with Columbus, then still with early Spanish explorers around the turn of the 16th century. Then it was the New World, where anything might be found. So it made sense to think that Israel could be too. In any case, the world was getting smaller, and they had to be somewhere, perhaps behind the couch. Over time, the Jewish Indian theory, or as Elizabeth Fenton has recently called it, the Hebrew Israelite theory, because most of the theorists knew nothing about Jews, in any case meant Israelites, took on many different guises. In the early 16th century, for example, the Dutch rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, the English Protestants Thomas Thorogood and John Dury all wrote books and tracts explaining why the lost tribes were to be found in the New World, but for very different reasons. In 1644, Antonio de Montesinos kicked off a sensation when he described encountering the lost tribes in the depth of the Andes. Throughout the early history of the colonized Americas, this idea would bear strange fruit, and it is characteristic of a world full of Israels that Israelite identifications were rarely one-sided. When the Mongols approached Europe, there were Jews who were excited by the prospect of the arrival of their distant kin, and while most natives refused the identification with Israel that was imposed on them, not all did. For a time at least, the Pequot preacher William Apis would use the idea to argue for better treatment from white Americans. Still, the most impactful and most enduring vision of Israel in America would appear in a book that was first published in Palmyra, New York in 1830 at E.B. Grandin's print shop, a book called The Book of Mormon. Those who have not read this book may not know that what it mainly is a story about a lost tribe of Israel that came to America around the time of a Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. They settled here and split into two warring families, the Nephites and the Lamanites. Mormon was the name of the last general of the Nephites, who before the climactic battle which his side lost, made sure to preserve the history of his people. Escaping the battle, his son Moroni would bury this record on the hill Cumorah in what would later be upstate New York. Centuries later, Moroni, now an angel, would appear to Joseph Smith to tell him where to find the book and how to translate it. The strong implication of the story was that the Native Americans of the present were the remains of Israelites of the past. In every one of these stories, we have two levels. We have the general, we have the specific. The general story is usually the same. Some part of Israel got somewhere else, some way or another, and became something else. A Judahite, a Beta Israel, a Native American. But each story is also shaped by the world that produced it. And this was to be a profoundly American story. In fact, every aspect of it is resonant, not only the story it tells, but also its translation and its first, drumroll please, adherents. For example, the idea of an ancient and more sophisticated native civilization preceding contemporary natives was widely entertained, and the region of Palmyra, New York was no exception. The idea of an ancient native war was, too. The old soldier, William Henry Harrison, 2 years before spending 1 month as United States president, would write a book in which he described the native mounds in the Ohio River as the remains of the defensive fortifications of such a people, making a desperate last stand before fleeing to Mexico and becoming the Aztecs. They were native mounds in the region of Palmyra, too, and as early as 1818, when Smith would have been 13, the local papers reported on the likelihood that they, too, were ancient forts. As for the emerging religion itself, another 1830 event of more than local import was one of the most famous Christian revivals of all time, which was held in Rochester, New York, by Charles Grandison Finney, father of modern revivalism. Later on, he would famously refer to this region as the burned-over district, so much aflame with the fires of religious enthusiasm that it eventually burned itself out. In 1844, in nearby Dresden, New York, came the Great Disappointment when William Miller's followers found that the second coming was not happening just right then after all. And at the time Smith published his book, there was still, in Jerusalem, New York, the followers of one of the most interesting figures in American religious history, the public universal friend. Jemima Wilkinson, once of Rhode Island, had grown seriously ill in 1776. When the illness passed, they claimed that Jemima herself was dead, and in her place was a genderless spirit named the public universal friend, a heaven-sent spirit of truth. The friend had died in 1819, but the society lingered for a while. A community of Shakers had also been founded in Sodus Bay, 30 miles from Palmyra, in 1826, and many of Smith's early followers were members of these new religious movements. Initially, it seems the early Mormons who gathered about Smith and made their way to such places as Kirtland, Ohio, Independence, Missouri, and Nauvoo, Illinois, did not view themselves as Israelites, but Gentiles tasked with discovering lost Israel, among the natives if possible, but around the world as well. But soon enough, even before Smith himself was killed in his prison cell in Nauvoo in 1844, the philosophy shifted, and an openness to the Mormon message began to be viewed as a sign of hidden Israelite descent, which is one reason why the Mormons are so interested in genealogy. Even today, Mormon missionary work is often constructed as a search for Israelites, here, there, and everywhere, and a Mormon coming-of-age ritual called the patriarchal blessing, and modeled after Jacob's deathbed blessing to his sons in Genesis 49, typically reveals to the blessee what tribe of Israel they hail from. Ephraim is the most common, followed by Manasseh. And yes, that is different from the biblical story on the level of historiography. It is not possible to demonstrate the Israelite descent of Native Americans or Mormons in the way that we can demonstrate it for the Judahites and Samaritans. But it is not different on the level of process, in the sense that biblical authors, too, are taking a story that is older than their work and making something out of it that matters to them. The growth and change of stories over time is not unusual and a sign of inauthenticity, but usual for stories of all sorts and essential to what makes them work. What we inherit provides the ingredients for what comes next. What anyone does with the ingredients is an expression of human creativity and human needs. That we are always reinventing ourselves with what we have in hand is a fact about identity, not just one kind of identity. The 12 tribes tradition, you can see I don't have much left, so if you're wanting to stretch your knees or whatever. The 12 tribes tradition is what scholars call a segmented identity tradition. There are two types of genealogical tradition: linear traditions, which describe descent from father to son or mother to daughter. Segmented traditions follow multiple lines or segments of descents at once. Think family tree. Segmented identity traditions have two special features that make them unusually adaptable compared to other kinds of identity traditions. First, by their very nature, they suggest that many different groups can also, at the same time, be one group. Reuben and Simeon can be Reuben and Simeon, and both can be Israel. Second, they're internally very adaptable, which makes them quite a flexible medium for competitions. Reubenites can tell a story about even though Simeonites are also Israelites, Reubenites are better Israelites than they are, say because Reuben was the older brother. Simeonites can tell a story in which they are better Israelites than Reubenites because Reuben committed some infraction or another. In the Bible, he's supposed to have slept with Bilhah, his father's concubine, for example. Segmented identity traditions are also easy to expand. In the earliest biblical tribal text, Machir and Gilead appear to be tribes. But in later ones, they are the descendants of Manasseh. And they can contract. In the Hebrew Bible, Reuben is Simeon's brother, and both are tribes of Israel. But Esau is Jacob's brother, and they're the founders of two different peoples. The segmented system doesn't necessarily mean anything by itself. You describe what is significant about the relationships when you use them to construct a vision of identity. In this book, I describe these features of the 12 tribes tradition as a reflection of what I call the separability of Israel and the primordialist premise, essentially the idea that any part of Israel is always Israel, but that different parts can go different ways. These elements of segmented traditions are the major engine of a world full of Israels. They explain how some part of Israel can go somewhere else and become something else and remain Israel. But the idea of the lost tribes of Israel, combined with the vagueness of the biblical vision of what happened to the tribes in the end, acts as a force multiplier. The tribes could be found almost anywhere, and so they generally have been. One thing I have tried to suggest today is that actually biblical authors are at least conceptually doing something similar to what we see in other places. This is not me saying the biblical constructions of Israelite identity and a lost tribe with no basis in historical reality are equally fake, to use a term that I think has little enough meaning. It's just to say the process is the same. People who didn't live in a place called ancient Israel explain how they were Israelites nonetheless by pointing to their connection to a larger superstructure that is Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. They adapted the traditions in various ways to stress the supremacy of Judah within Israel and to explain how Judah rose to prominence within it. Soon enough, the Samaritan Israelites will be doing the same thing in a different direction. In both cases, the same mechanisms of the same tradition were at work. The ability to explain how even though all of Israel existed somewhere, some part of it rose to prominence, took on a different character, became the heir to Israel's legacy. As I put it in the book, strange as it may seem, it is not really any more difficult to explain how part of Israel ended up with Mount Gerizim, the Samaritan Pentateuch, or Jerusalem in the biblical Torah, than it is to explain how another ended up with the Book of Mormon in upstate New York. And it is not really any more difficult to explain how Israel got separated between two biblical kingdoms, or between Israel and Assyria, Judah and Babylon, than it is to explain how very different people all around the world could still be part of the one and only Israel across oceans, continents, and great gulfs of time. But again, the point that I have been trying to make the most is not that this is how identity works in the special case of a world full of Israel. It is how identity works. It is a story. Sometimes the story is based on truths. Sometimes it isn't. But either way, we create a useful past through story. As with any story, we don't tell it for no reason. We don't tell it the same way twice. We make the past come alive in the way we want it to come alive or need it to come alive by telling it in a certain way, and we tell it a way that makes sense for the context we're telling it in. Not the only way it has ever been told, not the ancient way that has been handed down, but the one that fits the world we live in because of what we want the past to do. What we inherit from the past is not the story, but the ingredient of many stories, plot points, characters, significance. What we do next is up to us, anywhere in the world, at any time, even when the story is true. As for the lost tribes, the search will go on. They are a mystery, and the mystery calls to us. God has mislaid a people, and thousands, perhaps millions of others have taken up the search ever since. Generations have asked, have sought, have found. Generations have wondered, and we wonder still, and after all, from a certain religious perspective, they must be found. They are the protagonists of a sacred story that from the perspective of many contemporary religious traditions, never ended but is still unfolding today. They are the subject of biblical prophecies, yet unfulfilled, the heralds of an age to come. And to discover them is to describe ourselves in a special place within the unfolding of sacred time. And even to try is to embrace a role that elevates us above the everyday, deputizing ourselves to fulfill a holy and essential function. I very much doubt that there is any world full of Israel phenomena more common than a group emerging to inaugurate the ingathering of Israel, and there's a reason for that. Even so, the search goes on most of all because we have, in a sense, already found them, because they are with us still. Again, what is most unusual about this phenomenon is, on a technical level, also the most explicable. There are so many Israels in the world because there are simply so many places where the chartered traditions of Israelite identity, the stories of the Hebrew Bible itself, have a powerful presence. Israel is all around us, in fact, whether you are a religious believer or not, in everything from art and architecture to commercials and television series. It is a past that matters, no matter who you are, and so it is a past that will live again, that we will inhabit, and that we will pass on. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is David Kaufman. I'm just going to moderate the Q&A. I'm a professor in the history department at York University, and I help run the Center for Jewish Studies. These were two very, very interesting and very different talks. They were not a debate. This isn't going to be a debate. As I was listening, I registered, dozens and dozens of different possible kinds of questions that might emerge from the audience, because your talks were so interesting and good. So I'm very curious to hear what emerges from this Q&A. I think someone will be coming around with a microphone. It's currently over there. So if you have questions, you're going to raise your hand. What I think we would do best is to gather 3 questions at a time. And we'll repeat them. I guess we'll have a mic, so we'll be able to hear, and then we'll pose them to one or both of the speakers, and hopefully they can weave some answers together. And in this way, we'll hopefully be able to take as many questions and get as many different perspectives, since we do indeed touch on so many different things. We have until 5:02, so about 20 minutes, a little less than 20 minutes, about 15, 20 minutes. And let's get it going. Let's take our first question.
I've been looking at some of this material, so I'm familiar with some of it. I'm trying to put together a presentation. I found it really helpful discussing this to distinguish between what you've called either Israelites or Judahites and Jews. Because as I look into the material, Judaism is a faith. Those who follow it are Jewish. We are mostly, I think, in this room, Jewish because of the faith, not necessarily because of the genealogy and the lineage. And so as I try to figure things out, I try to refer to Jews and those who are descendants of the original tribes. And I wonder how you use language to make that distinction, looking, for example, the Kaifeng, Jews, the Beta Israel, Jews. These are all people who believe the same things, generally, that the rest of us in the room do, but don't necessarily have that lineage that goes way back. Comment.
Great. So let's take 2 more, and we'll pool them together. So more hands, and the mic will travel.
Hi. Thank you both. Or the 3 of you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you both, and you. I am of the assumption that people just don't disappear, and I would like to know where you are going to go now, as far as your research is concerned.
Great. And a third, if we can get the mic somewhere else. Great. I see your hand back up there. And then we'll take 3 next ones. Oh, sorry, over here.
I have a question about Sherit HaPleta. whoever stayed behind, whether there was exile or not, what happened to them other than the Shomronite, who they are or not, but the population that stayed, it wasn't empty completely, and not everyone was brought from Assyria. There was something there still staying. So who are they? Where are they?
So I'm going to have Steve answer first. And you don't have to answer all three of them if you don't want. And then we'll move to Andrew, and then we'll take another round. So think of your other questions as you're thinking about the responses.
Great. So to answer the first question about the meaning of Jew, and does that connote a religious identity based on belief as opposed to a ancestry-based identity based on lineage? So Jew is an English word. It's not the way Jews referred to themselves until relatively recently. It's a word that was used of Jews by others. If you look at the Talmud, for example, how do the authors of the Talmud refer to themselves, their people? It's Israel. So that term originates from outside of Judaism. It's superimposed on the people that we now think of as the Jews, and it never really 100% fit Jewish identity, which is somewhere in between a kind of tribal identity and it has components of a religious identity. And the idea that it's a religion like Christianity or Islam is an idea that developed under the influence of Christianity and Islam. There's a book by a scholar named Leonard Wolinsky, How Judaism Became a Religion. So it is a relatively modern, just to give a short answer to that question, the idea that Judaism is a religion based on belief, perfectly authentic conception of Judaism, but it's a relatively recent one. And for most of history, it was an ancestral identity from the point of view of Jews. The second question, so my presentation was based on a book I published about a decade ago called The Origin of the Jews. I have since moved to other kinds of research. I'll put in a plug for my new book, which is called Disasters of Biblical Proportions, which is how people retell the story of the 10 plagues. So I didn't go anywhere with that beyond what I presented to you. And the third question was about...
The question is about the remainders.
The remainder. So it's really interesting. There's a book in the Bible called the Book of Chronicles. Divrei HaYamim. There's two books, First Chronicles, Second Chronicles. Nobody ever reads it anymore because it's super boring, and it seems to repeat the story that's told in First Kings and Second Kings. However, if you read Chronicles very carefully, you see that it actually has an alternative version of Israelite history. It's a history where the Israelites never leave the land, ever. So there's no exodus in this version of history. And the only tribes who get deported by the Assyrians are the three tribes who have territory outside the land of Israel. The rest stay put. So even within the Bible itself, there's an alternative history of Israel that claims that the Israelites were never separated from the land of Israel. So this issue of the population that was left behind, from its perspective, the author of Chronicles' perspective, there was no population left behind. That's an idea that develops later on amongst Jews who are exiled to Babylonia. So there is archaeological evidence to show continued settlement in the land of Israel after the Assyrian conquest and the Babylonian conquest. There may someday be genetic evidence. And then there's the Samaritan tradition where the Samaritans claim direct descent from the population that never left the land. So that's something that is intriguing, and it's becoming ever more clear that what we have in the Hebrew Bible is from the perspective of one community that was exiled, and that there were other people who were never exiled, and that's not part of their experience.
So to start with the first question, I really appreciate this first question, because I think that makes me most uncomfortable about my own research on this topic is the idea that I might be saying, or sound like I'm saying to some people that, who's Jewish and who isn't. Even the rabbis in very early periods made provisions for conversion. Even in the beginning, even though this was not a proselytizing faith like Christianity was, there were people who joined the community who didn't have a genealogical background, and different rabbis had different opinions on how integrated they could be. So when I look at the Beit Israel, for example, these are people who have identified as Jewish for a very long time, who only want to live Jewish lives. And so as a historian, I can look at the evidence and say X, Y, and Z, but I do want to separate. Are they valid? Are they, is their faith real? They're Jews. They're Jews. And it's true for a lot of these communities. It gets complicated the more you look into it. So the Hebrew Israelites, for example, in America, the ones you probably may know best if you know anything about them, are the black Hebrew Israelites, who are tremendously anti-Semitic. And they believe that the original Jews were black, and that the white Jews stole their heritage, and have been lying about it for a long time. But they're actually only one of many Hebrew Israelite communities which are African American Jewish communities that exist, many of whom, just like the Beit Israel, just want to live Jewish lives and want to be identified as Jewish, even though if we looked into it, we would find that they didn't have biological descent going back thousands of years. So that's very important to me too. In terms of what I'm working on, I do lots of different things. I work a lot also on comparisons to the ancient Greek world, which is very interesting to me. But in this direction, I'm currently working on a book where I'm trying to figure out how the development of the concept of the 12 tribes took place during the biblical period. The earliest biblical text that deals with the tribes is probably Judges 5. It does not have 12 tribes. It doesn't have the tribes of Judah, Simeon, Levi, and Gad. It doesn't mention Jacob, for example. So I think there's a process of development over the course of the biblical period, even into the familiar vision of the 12 tribes, sons of Jacob, and so on. So that's what I'm looking into. But yeah, in terms of different communities in this region, I think it's a fascinating question. And more and more, the story in Genesis through Kings appears to me like something that I talked about, one group staking their claim against other groups that existed at that time. And you see this in Chronicles, as Stephen says, in a number of ways. One of my favorite parts in Chronicles, they show up to start to build the second temple, and a group of people meet them, and they say, hey, we just want to help. We've been worshiping Yahweh since the 8th century BC. We want to help out. And they say no, and then there's a big fight about it, and ultimately the temple doesn't get built for a while. But the Bible never really says who these people are. It never says anything other than they're the enemies of Israel and Judah. They are probably Judahites who are never exiled. And so what you see in the Bible is something that is shared between all these groups that has also changed in the way, as I say, that I think all stories are changed, to serve the interests of the group that's telling it, to compete with other legitimate heirs of Israel and the region. And in time, all of them but the Samaritans, I think, assimilated into a Jewish hegemonic Jewish tradition with local variations. But the Babylon Jewish community emerges as the most important Jewish community in the first century CE and so on. And we hear from a lot of them at other times. And as Stephen alluded to in his talk, we have lots of, they're just names mostly, but we can see Judahites who are Babylonian officials. We can see Judahites who are Assyrian officials. Many of them did well. They probably didn't come back. And we even there's something called the Elephantine papyri that are from Egypt, where there's a community of Jews who are living in Egypt while the second temple is being built. They build their own temple, which the Bible doesn't mention, and it's destroyed by Egyptian priests. And they write to Judahites and Israelites, and they say, can you help us? This subscription drive, can you help us, fundraise to rebuild this temple? And the Judahites don't respond, but the Israelites do. They say, we'd love to help you. We'd be happy to. So there are other ways to negotiate a relationship between these groups. They're more and more visible to us.
Fascinating. Let's take 3 more. We have until 5:02, so just under 10 minutes, maybe 7 more minutes. Can we take 3 more?
I'm sorry for those on Zoom who keep hearing me drink water. It was a lot of talking.
And maybe we'll make a collective effort to try to keep the questions brief and the answers brief.
Answers
and that
brief,
way maybe
yes.
we'll be able to get 1 more round in.
He's being polite. It's the answers that are not brief enough.
The Kohanim genetic markers, are they, is that the only genetic marker showing a connection to the ancient Israelites? Are there any of those markers present in any of these people who claim to be descendants?
Great question. Great. For these answers, we're going to take 3 still, but I'm only going to have 1 person answer each one, and then hopefully we'll get
all right.
Hear what's on your mind. Mike's coming to you.
Thank you for this. My question is with regards to the discrepancy you mentioned with how you count the tribes, where my understanding that forever it wasn't Judah and Levi, the southern tribes, but Judah and Benjamin, and the Levites were spread all over. But then you kind of mentioned 10 plus 1, and I didn't know there was a discrepancy. Could you maybe talk about that a little bit more?
Great. So these ones split evenly, these questions, and we'll
Nice.
get a third.
We'll have to fight over the last
Yeah,
one.
you'll have to fight over the last one.
Yeah, I could just answer one of them instead of all three if it's easier.
Seeing no more, let's take them, and then I'll keep an eye out for hands as well. So go ahead.
Okay, so that genetic marker of the Cohenine, which is called the Cohen modal haplotype, as I mentioned, that was 1998, and the science has gotten much more advanced. Scientists are much better able to decode the genetic script of DNA. So that is no longer a reliable distinguishing mark. It's no longer recognized as a reliable distinguishing mark of specifically a priest because it's found in other populations in the Middle East. It does often indicate Middle Eastern ancestry, but not specifically priestly ancestry. And actually, the genetics of Kohanim today, there's like 26 different genetic lineages that people have discovered. However, I do want to note that the science really has advanced. So one thing that scientists can do now is they can distinguish what people inherit from their paternal line from what they inherited from their maternal line, what they inherited from their male ancestors vis-a-vis their female ancestors. And the female ancestry of Jews, that's a whole thing unto itself. So for example, and I'll just mention this one discovery and then I'm done, there's a study that shows that about 50% of Ashkenazic Jews from kind of Eastern Europe, descend from one of just 4 women about 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago. So we can trace the maternal line of Ashkenazi Jews back to their female ancestors, and we can see that about 50% of Ashkenazi Jews today share 4 female ancestors about 1,000 years ago. So there's all kinds of discoveries like that that have happened and are still unfolding.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so to talk about the discrepancies, there are a number of discrepancies, and there are also some ways to mitigate them depending on which traditions you embrace. So there's some very explicit ones. So 1 Kings 11 through 12, Ahijah tears his cloak into 12. He does give Jeroboam 10. He does keep 1. That's it. There is in 12:20, Judah and Benjamin are part of Rehoboam's kingdom. In 12:21, it says really explicitly, there are no tribes followed after Rehoboam except the tribe of Judah alone. In 2 Kings 17, this Assyrian conquest story, it says none survive but the tribe of Judah alone. So there are ways to deal with a 10-in-2 split, and the Bible never tells you which are the 10 tribes of Israel, which I think is really interesting. I've written about that before. It tells you which the 2 are, it's Judah and Benjamin. To say, yes, Levi didn't count. Levi was spread out throughout all this. But then you have to harmonize other texts, because the texts that describe the territory of Simeon in Genesis through Kings always say the territory of the tribe of Simeon was within the territory of the tribe of Judah because it was too big for them. So how could it not be one of the tribes of Judah as well? As you probably know, there are actually 14 groups that are listed among the 12 tribes of Judah. There's Ephraim and Manasseh in addition to the 12 sons. So you can say, as many people do, Joseph and Levi fell out, Ephraim and Manasseh came in. It's consistent all the way through. But then you still have to deal with Judges 5, not a 12-tribe list. Deuteronomy 33 is called the Song of the Blessing of Moses, not a 12-tribe list. It doesn't have the tribe of Simeon in it. So it seems like biblical authors were also grappling with these deficiencies and giving us answers. Sometimes we have to decide whether to accept them or not, but sometimes there's not much to do. I mean, these tribes are missing from Judges 5, which is the earliest list, and there is 10-in-1, and it does say explicitly Judah is the only tribe of Judah, and so on.
Okay, these are fascinating, and I would like to keep you for a lot more to ask different kinds of questions that I have, but I'm not going to do that. We're going to call up Lisa to close us out, and after her remarks, we'll adjourn for refreshments.
Thank you all
if you
so
like,
much. I
and
really
thank you very
appreciate
much.
it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David, for moderating. And folks, I'm sure that you all agreed that this was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much to Steven and to Andrew. And I heard many what I like to call aha moments of discovery in the audience. I'm sure that this has whetted your appetites to, perhaps look out for the books and do more research. And thank you for such a stimulating afternoon, really. I just want to mention, some of you may know, but some of you may not know, that the Miles Nadal JCC has a 70-plus year history of hosting and providing enriching Jewish cultural and educational events, including lecture series, literary programs, film screenings, concerts, Holocaust education programs, Jewish holiday celebrations, and more. So here is just a little taste of what is coming up in the next few weeks. Manufacturing Hate, 10 Questions for Henry Ford, our film screening for Yom HaShoah, is here in the theater on Thursday, April the 16th. Our Yom Ha'atzmaut program, Popular Israeli Music, the year before October the 7th, is an illustrated music presentation with Benjamin Rubin on Thursday, April the 23rd. We had a wonderful question from award-winning set lighting costume designer Philip Silver earlier today. He is giving the fascinating lecture series, which definitely dovetails into this. Many coats, many colors, Jewish clothing across time and space. That begins here in the theater Monday, April the 27th. The Life and Art of Mashal Teitelbaum with Andrew Keir, winner of the Canadian Jewish Literary Award, is back in our theater Thursday, May 14th, and more. So flyers are in the lobby. I do encourage you to check them out before you leave. And now I invite you all to join us in the aerobic studio for our reception, which is presented in partnership with Grzinski Bakery and, of course, sponsored by York University Center for Jewish Studies. Our wonderful ushers are standing by to show you the way, and then you're welcome to bring your food back into the theater. We have seating in there as well. It has been my absolute pleasure spending time with you this afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.